Hello, welcome to my channel, Sea of Infinity. So in this video, I just wanted to kind of briefly talk about, ways of kind of keeping in that more peaceful, centered state during such sort of, energies and events occurring in, the greater world and reality, but also, in your own personal life and reality. Kind of taking that more Jesus approach, if you will. And, and the importance of, when certain things are a bit upsetting or a lot upsetting or can feel, a bit triggering or what have you in that way. The importance of, not becoming overwhelmed and almost, in a sense, like becoming a part of that problem in an energetic sense, not matching that energy. Still doing what you need to, but from a place of more, peaceful, calm, collected energy. Not engaging in violence or making things personal with, name calling or things like that, belittling others, and kind of employing that turn the other cheek sort of mentality, if you will. Not in a way that you're, being passive about it or, just putting your head in the sand or, being ignorant to things or, kind of just being like a silent bystander that just allows things to occur. Still being able to speak your truth and have your voice and, make a stand for certain things and, be passionate in that regard. But not doing so in a way that's like attacking, kind of with the great example of Jesus. He wasn't going out there and, being violent to others or, trying to incite like a rebellion in the sense of, attacking or doing any of that sort of stuff. He was still able to call out such, actions or behaviors, and was still able to, call out and address, corruption and issues with, the system and things like that, but doing so in a way that didn't make it personal about, people or anyone in particular, but just calling out the core issues instead and highlighting them, but in a way that he wasn't, positioning himself as an enemy that's like attacking them. Even though, they still may have taken it a little bit that way and, came up against him, that wasn't the sort of energy space that he was operating from. And that can be so important during these times to not sort of heighten those sort of, conflict type energies that we don't want or need. Still advocating for and working towards, things like reform and policy changes and all that sort of stuff, and protesting and all that sort of stuff, is still great, movements to make and be part of, but just not doing in a way that, incites literal, violence or, beginning like a big battle or a war or something like that. And also doing your best to not allow such things, as hard as it can be at times, to impact your own inner state and your own energy and experience, not letting that outer, world or reality to dictate or define your own inner world and reality. Still standing up and having courage and confidence in that aspect, but doing so in a way that's not coming from that more fear-based mentality or violent-based sort of mentality, but in a way that's still kind of, honoring and respecting that divinity of all. Like with Jesus's messages of, the kingdom of heaven being within, always being with you. So there is nothing to fear in that sense. We are infinite and eternal. And nothing can, dictate or take you away from that or remove you from, that heavenly space or that connection with God's source universe. As you are a part of it and it is a part of you in that sense. So not needing to have fear regarding anything in that regard, as all will always be well in that sense. And and any ends are just another beginning, or a transformation in another form entirely. You know, Jesus didn't go around advocating for saying that, you know, people doing certain things or certain behaviors or what have you are unworthy or sinful or anything like that. You know, he was still able to call out, you know, wrongdoings and corruption and, you know, faults and issues and hypocrisies, you know, with the system and certain ways of things occurring without making it personal about the person at all. You know, still advocating for that sense of we all, you know, have that ability to tap in and connect with the, you know, the kingdom within type aspect, and are all, you know, a part of that and are welcome to it if we so choose. And so, you know, not seeing people as like wrong or bad or, you know, irredeemable or, and, you know, like a monster or a villain or anything in that sort of sense, you know, kind of seeing it more as, you know, people at different stages of a journey, you know, that still always have that opportunity to take another pathway and are still on their journey of, you know, learning and coming back home to, you know, source, God, the kingdom within, however you like to see it or define it. Not taking that, you know, choice or, you know, truth away from anyone or trying to, you know, block anyone from that. You know, kind of keeping that balance of, you know, standing up for things and calling things out, but without trying to, you know, drag anyone down personally as you're doing it. Just instead, you know, addressing certain ways that things are dealt with or ways that certain things are occurring, rather than actually sort of addressing it as something that someone is doing and, you know, that means you're bad sort of vibe. You know, again, not in a way of, you know, being completely passive or just like, oh, you know, super, you know, friendly and welcoming and loving to everyone in a way that you're, you know, being ignorant or oblivious to things or putting yourself in a bit of a foolish position, you know, in the sense of, you know, not trying to go and cuddle with a tiger that's about to pounce and eat you, but also not trying to, you know, like attack it with a spear or shoot it dead or something either. You know, and still, you know, whilst holding into that sort of more peaceful calm and not being, you know, so personally attacking and violent, but still not allowing that to deter you away or having fear to stop you from still, like I said, you know, addressing things and calling things out and, you know, participating in steps for change and reform and all that sort of great, wonderful stuff. But just doing so in a way that, you know, doesn't kind of place everything more into that energy that we're trying to, you know, heal or step away from, rather than actually engage in it ourselves. That's why I do love that whole line of, you know, love and light, which a lot of people don't like, because, you know, it can tend to be used as a bit of a airy fairy way of saying things that can be a bit, you know, dismissive and ignorant and putting your head in the sand and, you know, toxic positivity. But the way I more see that sort of love and light aspect is, you know, having that love, having, you know, that operating and coming from that place of love, you know, for life and all things, and, you know, accepting the place and stage that, you know, each individual is at in their own journey. But then also, you know, having that light, you know, that blunt, honest, raw truth, you know, not being afraid to shine that light also in that aspect. And, you know, sometimes when you've been spending a long time in the dark, you know, when you suddenly step out into the light, you know, it can burn your eyes a little bit and sting. And, you know, it's not because the light itself is violent or hurtful or harmful, but just, you know, sometimes when you are in the dark for a little bit, so to speak, the light can sting a little. So, you know, not being afraid to still, you know, shine and express that light in that sense of raw, honest, authentic truth, you know, being as blunt and passionate with it as you need, but still, you know, also encompassing that love aspect as well, where you're not delving into sort of energies that, you know, do then sort of help facilitate other sort of energies that we are trying to, you know, sort of alchemize and transmute and all that sort of jazz. You know, might say quickly as well, I do notice that I'm wearing a shirt with some mushrooms and a frog, so that might be a sign or synchronicity for someone as well. And, you know, also just that importance as well of having that grace and forgiveness as well for your own self. If, you know, you do kind of step out of that balance a bit and, you know, do get a bit angry and hostile at certain things or what have you, you know, not to also be too hard on yourself either. You know, you're also on your own journey, and, you know, walking the middle way, as they say, and keeping that sort of balance can be really hard to do, especially when we're not, you know, used to doing it, and we are trying to do such a thing in, you know, certain environments and energetic atmospheres, if you will. Still having that, you know, grace and forgiveness for yourself in that sense, and, you know, leniency for yourself in that sense, that, you know, if you do wobble or fall a bit, to not let that deter you either from, you know, getting back up on the horse, so to speak. You know, it doesn't matter how many times you fall down, you can get up just as many times more. And, you know, none of us and no one is perfect in any sense. You know, and being human and being part of this experience isn't about being perfect anyhow. You know, messiness is part of humanness. So, you know, embracing and having the, you know, the grace and patience and forgiveness in a sense for those sort of things as well, for yourself and others. You know, and as hard as, you know, certain things can be sometimes, you know, in these sort of environments and with sort of certain, you know, energetic, you know, situations or parameters or whatever what you find yourself in, you know, sometimes things can be a bit triggering or distressing or painful, or, you know, all of that sort of stuff, but trying to just not let it overwhelm you too much, not in a way that, you know, you're being ignorant of things or, you know, completely disassociating completely from it, but just in a way as well of, you know, acceptance in that sense of also, you know, knowing that at the end of the day there is nothing to truly fear, and as difficult as these sort of processes and journeys can, you know, and experiences can be at times, that, you know, there is always that light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak, and, you know, it's not the final story, and you don't need to allow such things to overwhelm and dictate your whole entire experience in a way that it completely brings you down. You know, there's so much more to have faith in that aspect. You know, that was what was so powerful about people like Jesus in so many instances, is that, you know, he didn't have that fear of things in that sense. You know, he didn't have that fear of retaliation, you know, fear of death and fear of being attacked, or you know, fear of seeing and witnessing certain things. As much as it obviously would have, you know, upset him at times, he still, you know, didn't allow that to bring him down or to stop him or to, you know, take him out of that balance too much, in a sense. You know, he didn't allow it to discourage him in that way. He still had that faith and that knowing and, you know, that assuredness in his own truth, you know, and the truth of things, you know, fundamentally always going to be okay, and in a sense, you know, that there is nothing to fear in that sense. You know, everything is temporary in that sense, you know, and even the most horrible circumstances can become good again, and great and wonderful things can always come along, you know, afterwards or during or what have you. You know, that's the horrible part of the story, isn't always, you know, the end of the story, in a sense that, you know, is the final say on the story. You know, like I was saying before, you know, an ending is just another beginning. You know, we are infinite and eternal, and, you know, life and universe itself is infinite and eternal. So, you know, things always keep going, and beyond this sort of, you know, more dense earth reality we find ourselves in this human experience, you know, there is so much love and light and, you know, joy and peace and happiness that we all do get to, you know, return to and always are fundamentally a part of. You know, just that illusion of separation and, you know, the veil and things sometimes makes it a bit harder to to remember and easier to, you know, forget and become disconnected from, but we fundamentally always are connected to that and a part of it. You know, energy cannot be destroyed in that sense, you know, it can only be transformed. Alright, well, I might leave this one here for now. Sending you so much peace, love, light, and blessings as always. Bye.